If you really want to understand Malaysia's economy today, you can't just look at the last few decades. You have to go way back. Back to a time when the country's economic blueprint wasn't even its own. So let's dive into how that colonial legacy was built, piece by piece.
Picture this. Malaysia gains its independence in the late 1950s. It's a moment of celebration, right? But the new nation immediately inherits a massive problem. And this one number, it says it all. 50%. That's right. Half the population was living below the poverty line.
Which, of course, makes you wonder, how? How does a country that's literally bursting with natural resources, like rubber and tin, end up with so much poverty and inequality? Well, that's the central puzzle we're going to unpack here.
Yeah, this was not a fresh start, not by a long shot. The new nation wasn't handed a blank canvas. It was handed what you could call an unequal inheritance, a whole set of deep, tangled problems that needed to be fixed and fast.
So what exactly was in this inheritance? Well, first, just poverty everywhere. Second, a huge gap between the rich and the poor, which often mirrored ethnic lines. Then you had development that was totally lopsided. Some areas were built up while others were completely ignored. And to top it all off, the entire economy was basically balancing on just two commodities, rubber and tin. Talk about risky.
So how did it get this bad? Well, the answer lies in what we can call the colonial playbook. This wasn't a random series of events. It was a set of very specific, very strategic policies designed for one thing and one thing only: extraction. Okay, so Chapter 1 of this playbook: control the land. The British brought in new laws, like the Torrens system, to make land ownership official. But here's the catch. This wasn't about giving local people secure property. Nope. This was all about making it simple and legal for colonial businesses to grab land from massive plantations and mines.
All right, you've got the land. What's next? You need workers. So the playbook called for importing labor on a massive scale. Workers were brought in from China, mostly for the tin mines, and from India for the rubber plantations. This system was incredibly efficient, but it also created a workforce that was intentionally separated by sector and by ethnicity.
Then you have infrastructure. The railways are the perfect example here. You might think, oh great, connecting the country. But that wasn't their purpose at all. Those tracks were laid with a single goal in mind: to get rubber and tin from the mines and plantations to the ports as quickly as possible. This effectively created two Malaysias: a modern, export-focused economy and a traditional local economy that was just left behind. In the final piece of the playbook, education. Yes, English schools were established, but the primary goal wasn't to uplift the general population. It was to create a local class of clerks and administrators, basically to train the people needed to help run the colonial machine smoothly. It was education in service of the empire.
So you see, policies for land, for labor, for infrastructure, and for education. Each one was a deliberate move. And when you put it all together, what they left behind was this profound, deeply ingrained legacy of division. Let's connect those dots right now.
I mean, just look at this. It's a straight line from cause to effect. The policy of bringing in a segregated workforce, that led directly to massive differences in living standards along ethnic lines. Building infrastructure only for resource extraction, that created the uneven regional development we talked about. And that hyper-focus on just rubber and tin, it left the entire economy dangerously exposed to swings in the global market. The point is, these problems at independence were no accident. They were the calculated results of colonial policy.
And listen, this wasn't some kind of secret agenda that historians uncovered later. The source material is pretty blunt about it, calling it a deliberate attempt to keep the different ethnic groups separate, not just in where they lived, but in the jobs they did. That's an intention with powerful, long-lasting consequences.
So, facing this inheritance, what could the new nation do? Well, one thing was for sure. They couldn't keep playing by the old rules. It was time to tear up that colonial playbook and start writing a completely new one. It was time to chart a new course. And they went about this with a really organized, structured plan. You could kind of think of it in 3 layers. At the top, you have the long-term vision, the big goals for 10, 20 years down the road. In the middle, you've got the blueprint, like the famous 5-year Malaysia plans. And then you have the yearly budget, the short-term actions that made it all happen. And the goals of this new plan? They were a world away from the colonial mindset. This was now about Malaysia shaping its own destiny. It was about firing up the entire economy, not just a few export industries. And, critically, it was about achieving social goals, like distributing wealth more fairly and making sure everyone had access to major public utilities.
This new way of thinking also changed the definition of poverty itself. It wasn't just a number anymore, or simply a lack of stuff.
It was about understanding the human cost, the insecurity, the powerlessness, the feeling of being excluded from your own society. Tackling that became the true mission.
Ultimately, when you look at the whole story, Malaysia's economic journey is this powerful, real-world lesson in decolonization. It asks a question that so many nations have had to face. When you inherit a blueprint that was designed by someone else for someone else's benefit, how do you find the vision, the plan, and the will to build a home of your own?